While the House Judiciary Committee moves forward with its investigations into Donald Trump, it's also taking on an issue the president refuses to talk about: the threat of white nationalism. The Daily Beast reports that the House Judiciary Committee will hold a hearing in the coming weeks to address the rise in white nationalism and hate crimes in the United States. The announcement comes just days after the attack on Muslims in New Zealand that killed 50 people. The New Zealand mosque shooter praised Trump in his manifesto as, quote, a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. The shooter disparaged immigrants as an invasion, language Trump has frequently used and Trump used on Friday while downplaying the threat posed by white supremacists. This morning, Trump tweeted, quote, the fake news media is working overtime to blame me for the horrible attack in New Zealand. So ridiculous. But David Leonhardt wrote in the New York Times, quote, Trump doesn't deserve to be blamed for any specific crime, but he does deserve blame for the trend. It isn't very complicated. The man with the world's largest bully pulpit keeps encouraging violence and white nationalism. Lo and behold, white nationalist violence is on the rise. You have to work pretty hard to persuade yourself that's just a big coincidence. USA Today reports that some human rights leaders are concerned that the United States is exporting extremism by inspiring a global trend of hatred fueled by xenophobic, ethno-nationalistic, and anti-immigrant feelings. And there's growing concern about white nationalism in the U.S. military. An investigation by Huffington Post revealed that, quote, leaked chat logs have connected 7 current members of the U.S. Armed Forces to a white nationalist group. And a 2017 poll conducted by the Military Times found that nearly 25% of service members surveyed said they had encountered white nationalists within their ranks. That poll found that 30% of troops said they saw white nationalism as a bigger threat to national security than the wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But Donald Trump has actually cut federal funding from groups tasked with combating right-wing extremism. This is true. He did so after failing to condemn neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. Still, White House officials defended the president.
He has denounced bigotry many times, and I wouldn't be working here if I believed otherwise.
You've seen the president stand up for religious liberties, individual liberties. The president is not a white supremacist. I'm not sure how many times we have to say that.
Joining us now is a member of the House Judiciary Committee, freshman Congressman Joe Neguse, a Democrat from Colorado. Congressman, good to talk to you again. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Ali, for having me.
How do we go forward with this? This is a strange moment in American history where we are having a conversation about whether or not the President of the United States encourages, or at least doesn't discourage, the growth of white nationalism and white supremacy.
Well, I think we go forward by having conversations just like this one. I mean, much of what you described obviously is deeply concerning to me as an African-American, as a son of immigrants, and as a United States congressman. I spent this weekend visiting with folks here in Boulder, was at the Islamic Center, the local mosque here in Boulder just yesterday, with over 600 people as we gathered to grieve together over the lives lost in New Zealand and to have some important conversations about how we can unite together and love one another as brothers and sisters. And I will tell you, there were people of all faiths and all backgrounds gathered in that room. The unity was really palpable. I wish that we had a president that would express those same sentiments. Of course, as you have outlined, we unfortunately do not.
Congressman, you know, the president after Charlottesville did ultimately say that neo-Nazis are not good. But I keep wondering, when he was associated by the shooter in New Zealand, with the shooter in New Zealand, it would have been a fantastic opportunity for the president to have said any one of 100 things, disassociating himself from it. But he didn't do that. He downplayed that. I suspect if someone tied you to a crime, you'd go out of your way to clear your name if you could.
Yeah, certainly. And as you said, I mean, it's not a hard call to be able to ultimately call this for what it was and to denounce it. And it's unfortunate that the president chose not to do that. Clearly, I think you see people of all, in many ways, political faiths as well. I mean, I'd be candid with you, Ali. There are plenty of Democrats and Republicans who I've talked to over the course of this last few days who were terribly upset and mourned what happened in New Zealand. So I just, again, regret that the White House refuses to play a leadership role on this front.
However, America can move forward regardless of whether that White House plays a leadership role. Do you know anything about the House Judiciary Committee holding hearings on white nationalism?
I don't. That was the first that I had heard of it. Was you mentioning it here on the segment tonight? I don't know that I've received any kind of formal notice that the Judiciary Committee is going to hold that kind of hearing. There certainly have been letters of inquiry, letters of protest from a variety of different members of the Judiciary Committee and other committees in Congress to a variety of federal agencies, really making clear their desire for more action on this front, given the trend lines, which are very clear. So, whether or not ultimately a hearing takes place in the Judiciary Committee or another committee of jurisdiction, say the Homeland Security Committee, clearly these conversations are going to be happening in Congress. And frankly, they're happening across the country. They're happening around dinner tables, around kitchen tables, in living rooms, and in coffee shops and in boardrooms. And it's important for those discussions to happen.
So what role then, as a member of Congress or as a member of the Judiciary Committee, do you think this is a role for Congress? This is serious. The numbers are very clear. I just want to quote from an NBC article that has information on the extremism, white extremism. The Anti-Defamation League said domestic extremists killed at least 50 people in the United States in 2018, up from 37 in 2017. White supremacists were responsible for the great majority of the killings, which is typically the case. The group wrote, between 2008 and 2016, far-right plots and attacks outnumbered Islamist incidents inspired by groups such as ISIS by almost 2 to 1. The number of hate groups operating across America also rose to a record high of 1,020 in 2018. That's according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Congressman, this is a serious problem in 2019 if this is happening.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And obviously the empirical data that you just outlined is deeply sobering, and it speaks for itself. So, yes, I think there is a role for Congress in its oversight responsibilities. I suspect that perhaps the Homeland Security and Crime Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee or the Homeland Security Committee as well, I suspect will be taking a deeper look to make sure that the federal agencies that are responsible for preventing domestic terrorism and prosecution of hate crimes and so forth, that they are well resourced and that they're taking this seriously, because clearly, given the data and the trend lines, it's something that we all ought to be talking about and acting on.
Congressman Joe Neguse, good to see you as always. Thank you, sir.
No, thank you. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.